A Search in Secret India by Paul Brunton. Chapter 16. In a Jungle Hermitage. There are moments unforgettable which mark themselves in golden figures upon the calendar of our years. Such a moment comes to me now as I walk into the hall of the Maharishi. He sits as usual upon the magnificent tiger skin which covers the center of his divan. The joss sticks burn slowly away on a little table near him, spreading the penetrating fragrance of incense around the hall. Not today is he remote from men and wrapped up in some trance-like spiritual absorption, as on that strange occasion when I first visited him. His eyes are clearly open now to the world and glance at me comprehendingly as I bow, and his mouth is stretched in a kindly smile of welcome. Squatting at a respectful distance from their master are a few disciples. Otherwise, the long hall is bare. One of them pulls the punkah fan, which flaps lazily through the heavy air. In my heart, I know that I come as one seeking to take up the position of a disciple, and that there will be no rest for my mind until I hear the Maharishi's decision. It is true that I live in a great hope of being accepted, for that which sent me scurrying out of Bombay to this place came as an absolute command, a decisive and authoritative injunction from a supernormal region. In a few words, I dispose of the preliminary explanations and then put my request briefly and bluntly to the Maharishi. He continues to smile at me, but says nothing. I repeat my question with some emphasis. There is another protracted pause, but at length he answers me, disdaining to call for the services of an interpreter and expressing himself directly in English. What is all this talk of masters and disciples? All these differences exist only in the disciple's standpoint. To the one who has realized the true self, there is neither master nor disciple. Such a one regards all people with equal eye. I am slightly conscious of an initial rebuff. And though I press my request in other ways, the Maharishi refuses to yield on the point. But in the end, he does say, you must find the master within you, within your own spiritual self. You must regard his body in the same way that he regards himself. The body is not his true self. It begins to voice itself in my thoughts that the Maharishi is not to be drawn into giving me a direct affirmative response, and that the answer I seek must be found in some other way, doubtless in the subtle, obscure manner at which he hints. So I let the matter drop, and our talk then turns to the outward and material side of my visit. I spend the afternoon making some arrangements for a protracted stay. A Search in Secret India by Paul Brunton. The ensuing weeks absorb me into a strange, unwanted life. My days are spent in the hall of the Maharishi, where I slowly pick up the unrelated fragments of his wisdom and the faint clues to the answer I seek. My nights continue as heretofore, in torturing sleeplessness, with my body stretched out on a blanket, laid on the hard earthen floor of a hastily built hut. This humble abode stands about 300 feet away from the hermitage. Its thick walls are composed of thinly plastered earth, but the roof is solidly tied to withstand the monsoon rains. The ground around its virgin bush, somewhat thickly overgrown, being in fact the fringe of the jungle, which stretches away to the west. The rugged landscape reveals nature in all her own wild, uncultivated grandeur. Cactus hedges are scattered numerously and irregularly around. The spines of these prickly plants look like coarse needles. Beyond them, the jungle drops a curtain of scrub brush and stunted trees upon the land. To the north rises the gaunt figure of the mountain, a mass of metallic tinted rocks and brown soil. To the south lies a long pool, whose placid water has attracted me to the spot, whose banks are bordered with clumps of trees, holding families of gray and brown monkeys. Each day is a duplicate of the one before. I rise early in the mornings and watch the jungle dawn turn from gray to green and then to gold. Next comes a plunge into the water and a swift swim up and down the pool, making as much noise as I possibly can so as to scare away lurking snakes. Then, dressing, shaving, and the only luxury I can secure in this place, 3 cups of deliciously refreshing tea. "Master, the pot of tea water is ready," says Raju, my hired boy. From the initial total ignorance of the English language, he has acquired that much and more under my occasional tuition. As a servant, he is a gem, for he will scour up and down the little township with optimistic determination in quest of the strange articles and foods for which his Western employer speculatively sends him, and he will hover outside the Maharishi's hall in discreet silence during meditation hours, should he happen to come along for orders at such times. But as a cook, he is unable to comprehend Western taste, which seems a strange, distorted thing to him. After a few painful experiments, I myself take charge of the more serious culinary arrangements, reducing my labor by reducing my solid meals to a single one each day. Tea, taken thrice daily, becomes both my solitary earthly joy and the mainstay of my energy. Raju stands in the sunshine and watches with wonderment my addiction to the glorious brown brew. His body shines in the hard yellow light like polished ebony, for he is a true son of the black Dravidians, the primal inhabitants of India. After breakfast comes my lazy, quiet stroll to the hermitage, a halt for a couple of minutes beside the sweet rose bushes in the compound garden, which is fenced in by bamboo posts, or a rest under the drooping fronds of the palm trees, whose heads are heavy with coconuts. It is a beautiful experience to wander around this hermitage garden before the sun has waxed in power, and to see and smell the variegated flowers. And then I enter the hall, bow before the Maharishi, and quietly sit down on folded legs. I may read or write for a while, or engage in conversation with one or two of the other men, or tackle the Maharishi on some point, or plunge into meditation for an hour along the lines which the sage has indicated, although evening usually constitutes the time specially assigned to meditation in the hall. But whatever I am doing, I never fail to become gradually aware of the mysterious atmosphere of the place, of the benign radiations which steadily percolate into my brain. I enjoy an ineffable tranquility merely by sitting for a while in the neighborhood of the Maharishi. By careful observation and frequent analysis, I arrive in time at the complete certitude that a reciprocal inter-influence arises whenever our presences neighbor each other. The thing is most subtle, but it is quite unmistakable. At 11, I return to the hut, for the midday meal, and to rest and then go back to the hall to repeat my program of the morning. I vary my meditations and conversations, sometimes by roaming the countryside or by descending on the little township to make further explorations of the colossal temple. From time to time, the Maharishi unexpectedly visits me at the hut after finishing his own lunch. I seize the opportunity to plague him with further questions, which he patiently answers in terse epigrammic phrases, clipped so short as rarely to constitute complete sentences. But once, when I propound some fresh problem, he makes no answer. Instead, he gazes out toward the jungle-covered hills, which stretch to the horizon and remain motionless. Many minutes pass, but still his eyes are fixed, his presence remote. I am quite unable to discern whether his attention is being given to some invisible psychic being in the distance or whether it's being turned on some inward preoccupation. At first, I wonder whether he has heard me, but in a tense silence which ensues, and which I am unable or unwilling to break, a force greater than my rationalistic mind commences to awe me until it ends by overwhelming me. The realization forces itself through my wonderment that all my questions are moves in an endless game, the game of thoughts, which possess no limit to their extent, that somewhere within me there is a well of certitude which can provide me with all the waters of truth that I require, and that it will be better to cease my questioning and attempt to realize the tremendous potencies of my spiritual nature. So I remain silent and wait. For almost half an hour the Maharishi's eyes continued to stare straight in front of him. In a fixed, unmoving gaze, he appears to have forgotten me. But I am perfectly aware that the sublime realization which has suddenly fallen upon me is nothing else than a spreading ripple of telepathic radiation from this mysterious and imperturbable man. On another visit, he finds me in a pessimistic mood. He tells me of the glorious goal which awaits for the man who takes to the way he has shown. But Maharishi, the path is full of difficulties, and I am so conscious of my own weaknesses, I plead. That is the surest way to handicap oneself, he answers unmoved. This burdening of one's mind with the fear of failure and the thought of one's failings. Yet, if it is true, I persist. It is, it is not true. The greatest error of a man is to think that he is weak by nature, evil by nature. Every man is divine and strong in his real nature. What are weak and evil are his habits, his desires and thoughts, but not himself. His words come as an invigorating tonic. They refresh and inspire me. From another man's lips, from some lesser or feebler soul, I would refuse to accept them at such worth and would persist in refuting them. But an inward monitor assures me that the sage speaks out of the depths of a great and authentic spiritual experience, and not as some theorizing philosopher mounted on thin stilts of speculation. Another time, when we are discussing the West, I make the retort, "It is easy for you to attain and keep spiritual serenity in this jungle retreat, where there is nothing to disturb you or distract you. When the goal is reached, when you know the knower, there is no difference between living in a house in London and living in the solitude of a jungle," comes the calm rejoinder. And once I criticized the Indians for the neglect of material development. To my surprise, the Maharishi frankly admits the accusation. It is true. We are a backward race, but we are a people with few wants. Our society needs improving, but we are contented with much fewer things than your people. So to be backward is not to mean that we are less happy. A Search in Secret India by Paul Brunton. How has the Maharishi arrived at the strange power and stranger outlook which he possesses? Bit by bit, from his own reluctant lips and from those of his disciples, I pieced together a fragmentary pattern of his life story. He was born in 1879 in a village about 30 miles distant from Madura, which is a noted South Indian town, possessing one of the largest temples in the country. His father followed some avocation connected with law and came from good Brahmin stock. His father appears to have been an extremely charitable man who fed and clothed many poor persons. The boy eventually passed to Madura to carry on his education, and it was here that he picked up the rudiments of English from some American missionaries who were conducting a school. At first, young Ramana was fond of play and sport. He wrestled, boxed, and swam dangerous rivers. He betrayed no special interest in religion or philosophical concerns. The only exceptional thing in his life at that time was a tendency to somnambulism or sleepwalking, or to a condition of sleep so profound that the most disturbing interruptions could not awaken him. His schoolmates eventually discovered this and took advantage of it to sport with him. During the daytime they were afraid of his quick punch, but at night they would come into his bedroom and take him into the playground, beat his body and box his ears, and then lead him back to bed. He was quite unconscious of these experiences and had no remembrance of them in the mornings. The psychologist who has correctly understood the nature of deep sleep will find in this account of the boy's abnormal depth of attention sufficient indication of the mystical nature which he possessed. One day, a relative came from Madura and, in answers to Ramana's question, mentioned that he had just returned from a pilgrimage to the temple of Arunachala. The name stirred some slumbering depths in the boy's mind, thrilling him with peculiar expectations which he could not understand. He inquired as to the whereabouts of this temple, and ever after found himself haunted by thoughts of it. It seemed to be of paramount importance to him, yet he could not even explain to himself why Arunachala could mean anything more to him than the dozens of other great temples which are scattered over India. He continued his studies at the mission school without showing any special aptitude for them, although he always evinced a fair degree of intelligence in his work. But when he was 17, destiny, with swift and sudden strokes, got into action and thrust its hands through the even tenor of his days. He suddenly left the school and completely abandoned all his studies. He gave no notice to his teachers or to his relatives and told no one before the event actually occurred. What was the reason of this unpromising change, which cast a cloud upon his future worldly prospects? The reason was satisfying enough to himself, though it might have seemed mind-perplexing to others. For life, which in the ultimate is the teacher of men, set the young student on another course than that which his school teachers had assigned him, and the change came in a curious way about 6 weeks before he dropped his studies and disappeared from Madura forever. He was sitting alone one day in his room when a sudden and inexplicable fear of death took hold of him. He became acutely aware that he was going to die. Although outwardly he was in good health, the thing was a psychological phenomenon, because there was no apparent reason why he should die. Yet he became obsessed with this notion and immediately began to prepare for the coming event. He stretched his body prone upon the floor, fixed his limbs in the rigidity of a corpse, closed his eyes and mouth, and finally held his breath. Well then, said I to myself, this body is dead. It will be carried stiff to the burning ground and then reduced to ashes. But with the death of the body, am I dead? Is the body I? This body is now silent and stiff, but I continue to feel the full force of myself, apart from its condition. These are the words which Maharishi used in describing the weird experience through which he passed. What happened next is difficult to understand, though easy to describe. He seemed to fall into a profound conscious trance, wherein he became merged into the very source of selfhood, the very essence of being. He understood quite clearly that the body was a thing apart, and that the I remained untouched by death. The true self was very real, but it was so deep down in man's nature that hitherto he had ignored it. Ramana emerged from this amazing experience an utterly changed youth. He lost most of his interest in studies, sports, friends, and so on, because his chief interest now centered in the sublime consciousness of the true self, which he had found so unexpectedly. Fear of death vanished as mysteriously as it came. He enjoyed an inward serenity and a spiritual strength which have never since left him. Formerly, he had been quick to retaliate at the other boys when they had chaffed him or attempted to take liberties, but now he put up with everything quite meekly. He suffered unjust acts with indifference and bore himself among others with complete humility. He gave up old habits and tried to be alone as much as possible, for then he could sink into meditation and surrender himself to the absorbing current of divine consciousness which constantly drew his attention inwards. These profound changes in his character were, of course, noticed by others. One day, his elder brother came into his room when the boy was supposed to be doing his homework and found him sunk in meditation with closed eyes. The school books and papers had been tossed across the room in disgust. The brother was so annoyed at this neglect of studies that he jeered at him with sharp words. What business has a fellow like you? If you want to behave like a yogi, why are you studying for a career? Young Ramana was deeply stung by these words. He immediately realized their truth and silently decided to act upon them. His father was dead, and he knew that his uncle and other brothers would take care of his mother. Truly, he had no business there. And back into his mind there flashed the name which had haunted him for nearly a year, the name whose very syllables fascinated him, the name of the temple of Arunachala. Thither would he go, although why he should select that place, he was quite unable to say. But an impelling urgency arose within him and formed the decision for him of its own accord. It was entirely unpremeditated. I was literally charmed here, said the Maharishi to me. The same force which drew you to this place from Bombay drew me to sit to it from Madura. And so young Ramana, feeling this inner pull within his heart, left his friends, family, school, and studies and took to the road, which eventually brought him to Arunachala and to a still profounder spiritual attainment. He left behind a brief farewell letter, which is still preserved in the hermitage. Its flourishing Tamil characters read as follows. I have, in search of my Father, and in obedience to his command, started from here. This is only embarking on a virtuous enterprise. Therefore, none need grieve over this affair. To trace this out, no money need be spent. With 3 rupees in his pocket and in utter ignorance of the world, he set out on his journey into the interior of the South. The amazing incidents which marked that journey proved conclusively that some mysterious power was protecting and guiding him. When at last he arrived at his destination, he was utterly destitute and among total strangers, but the emotion of total renunciation was burning strong within him. Such was the youth's scorn for all earthly possessions at the time that he flung his robe aside and took up his meditative posture in the temple precinct, quite nude. A priest observed this and remonstrated with him, but to no purpose. Other shocked priests came along, and after vehement efforts forced a concession from the youth. He consented to wear a semi-loincloth, and that is all he has ever worn to this day. A Search in Secret India by Paul Brunton. For 6 months he occupied various spots in the precinct, never going anywhere else. He lived on some rice, which was brought to him once a day by a priest who was struck by the precocious behavior of the youth. For Ramana spent the entire day plunged in mystical trances and spiritual ecstasies so profound that he was entirely oblivious to the world around him. When some rough Muslim youths flung mud at him and ran away, he was quite unaware of the fact until some hours later. He felt no resentment against them in his heart. The stream of pilgrims who descended on the temple made it difficult for him to obtain the seclusion he desired, so he left the place and moved to a quiet shrine set in the field some distance from the village. Here he continued to stay for 1.5 years. He was satisfied with the food brought by the few people who visited his shrine. Throughout this time he spoke to no one. Indeed, he never opened his lips to talk until 3 years passed since his arrival in the district. This was not because he had taken a vow of silence, but because his inner monitor urged him to concentrate all his energy and attention upon his spiritual life. When his mystic goal was attained, the inhibition was no longer necessary, and he began to talk again, though the Maharishi has remained an extremely taciturn man. He kept his identity a complete secret, but by chain of events, his mother discovered his whereabouts 2 years after his disappearance. She set out for the place with her eldest son and tearfully pleaded with him to return home. The lad refused to budge. When tears failed to persuade him, she began to upbraid him for his indifference. Eventually, he wrote down a reply on a piece of paper to the effect that a higher power controls the fate of men, and that whatever she did could not change his destiny. He concluded by advising her to accept the situation and to cease moaning about it, and so she had to yield to his obstinacy. When through this incident people began to intrude on his seclusion in order to stare at the youthful yogi, he left the place and climbed up the hill of the Holy Beacon and made his residence in a large cavern where he lived for several years. There are quite a few other caves on this hill, and each one shelters holy men or yogis. But the cave which sheltered young Ramana was noteworthy because it also contained the tomb of a great yogi of the past. Cremation is the usual custom of the Hindus in disposing of their dead, but it is often prohibited in the case of a yogi who is believed to have attained who has made the highest attainment, because it is also believed that the vital breath or unseen life current remains in the body for thousands of years and renders the flesh exempt from corruption. In such a case, the yogi's body is bathed and anointed and then placed in a tomb, in a sitting position with legs crossed, as though he was still plunged in meditation. The entrance to the tomb is sealed with a heavy stone and then cemented over. Usually, the mausoleum becomes a place of pilgrimage. There exists still another reason why great yogis are buried and not cremated, and that is because of the belief that their bodies do not need to be purified by fire, since they were purified during their lifetimes. It is interesting to consider that caves have always been a favorite residence of yogis and holy men. The ancients consecrated them to the gods. Zoroaster, the founder of the Parsi faith, practiced his meditations in a cave, while Muhammad received his religious experience in a cave also. The Indian yogis have very good reasons for preferring caves or subterranean retreats when better places are not available, for here they can find shelter from the vicissitudes of weather and from the rapid changes of temperature which divide days from nights in the tropics. There is less light and noise to disturb their meditations, and breathing the confined atmosphere of a cave causes the appetite to diminish markedly, thus conducing a minimum of bodily cares. Still another reason which may have attracted Ramana to this particular cave on the hill of the Holy Beacon was the beauty of its outlook. One can stand on a projecting spur adjoining the cave and see the little township stretched up flat in the distant plain, with a giant temple rising at its centerpiece. Far below the plain stands a long line of hills, which frontier a charming panorama of nature. Anyway, Ramana lived in this somewhat gloomy cavern for several years, engaged in his mysterious meditations and plunged in profound trances. He was not a yogi in the orthodox sense, for he had never studied any system of yoga, and he had never practiced under any teacher. The inner path which he followed was simply a track leading to self-knowledge. It was laid down by what he conceived to be the divine monitor within him. In 1905, plague appeared in the locality. The dread visitant was probably carried into the district by some pilgrim to the temple of Arunchala. It devastated the population so fiercely that almost everyone left the little township and fled in terror to safer villages or towns. So quiet did the deserted place become that tigers and leopards came out of their lurking dens in the jungle and moved openly through the streets. But though they must have roamed the hillside many times, for it stood in their path to the township, though they must have crossed and repassed the Maharishi's cave, he refused to leave, but remained as calm and unmoved as ever. By this time, the young hermit had involuntarily acquired a solitary disciple who had become very much attached to him and persisted in staying by his side and attending his needs. The man is now dead, but the legend has been handed down to other disciples that each night a large tiger came to the cave and licked Ramana's hands, and that the tiger was in return fondled by the hermit. It sat in front of him throughout the night and departed only at dawn. There is a widespread notion throughout India that yogis and fakirs who live in the jungles or on the mountains, exposed to the danger from tigers, lions, and snakes and other wild creatures, move unharmed, untouched, as if they had attained a sufficient degree of yogic power. Another story about Ramana told how he was once sitting in the afternoon outside the narrow entrance to his abode when a large cobra came swishing through the rocks and stopped in front of him. It raised its body and spread out its hood, but the hermit did not attempt to move. The two beings, man and beast, faced each other for some minutes, gaze meeting gaze. In the end, the snake withdrew and left him unharmed, although it was within striking distance. The austere, lonely life of this strange young man closed its first phase with the firm and permanent establishment in the deepest point of his own spirit. Seclusion was no longer an imperative need, but he continued to live at the cave until the visit of an illustrious Brahmin pundit, Ganapati Shastri, proved another turning point in his outer life, which was now to enter a more social period. The pundit had recently come to stay near the temple for study and meditation. He heard by chance that there was a very young yogi on the hill, and out of curiosity he went to search him out. When he found Ramana, the latter was staring fixedly at the sun. It was not at all uncommon for the hermit to keep his eyes on the dazzling sun for some hours, till it disappeared below the western horizon. The glaring light of the rays of the afternoon sun in India can hardly be appreciated by a European who has never experienced it. I remember once when I had set out to climb the steep ascent of the hill at a wrong hour, being caught without shelter by the full glare of the sun at midday on my return journey. I staggered and reeled about like a drunken man for quite some time. So the feat of young Ramana in enduring the merciless glare of the sun with face uplifted and eyes unflinching may therefore be better evaluated. The pundit had studied all the chief books of Hindu wisdom for a dozen years and had undergone rigorous penances in an endeavor to reach some tangible spiritual benefit. But he was still afflicted with doubts and perplexities. He put a question to Ramana, and after 15 minutes received a reply which amazed him with its wisdom. He put further questions involving his own philosophical and spiritual problems, and was still more astounded at the clearing up of perplexities which had troubled him for years. As a result, he prostrated himself before the young hermit and became a disciple. Shastri had his own group of followers in the town of Vellore, Vellore, and he went back later and told them that he had found a Maharishi, in brackets, a great sage or seer, because the latter was undoubtedly a man of the highest spiritual realization, whose teachings were so original that the pundit had found nothing exactly like them in any book that he had read. From that time, the title of Maharishi began to be applied to the young Ramana by cultured people, although the common folk wanted to worship him as a divine being when his existence and character became better known to them. But the Maharishi strongly forbade every manifestation of such worship in his presence. Among themselves and in private talk with me, most of his devotees and people of the locality insist in calling him a god. A small group of disciples attached themselves to the Maharishi in time. They built a wooden frame bungalow on a lower spur of the hill and persuaded him to live in it with them. In different years, his mother had paid short visits and become reconciled to his vocation. When death parted her from her eldest son and other relatives, she came to the Maharishi and she begged him to let her live with him. He consented. She spent the 6 years of life which were left to her at his side and finished up by becoming an ardent disciple of her own son. In return for the hospitality which was given her in the little hermitage, she acted as a cook. When the old lady died, her ashes were buried at the foot of the hill, and some of the Maharishi's devotees built a small shrine over the place. Here, ever-burning sacred lamps glow in memory of this woman, who gave a great sage to mankind, and little heaps of scented jasmines and marigolds snatched from their stalks are thrown on a tiny altar offering to her spirit. In offering to her spirit. The efflux of time spread the reputation of the Maharishi throughout the locality, so that the pilgrims of the temple were often induced to go up to the hill to see him before they returned home. Quite recently, the Maharishi yielded to incessant requests and consented to grace the new and large hall which was built at the foot of the hill as a residence for him and his disciples. The Maharishi has never asked for anything but food and consistently refuses to handle money. Whatever else has come to him has been voluntarily pressed upon him by others. During those early years when he tried to live a solitary existence, when he built a wall of almost impenetrable silent reserve around him, whilst he was perfecting his spiritual powers, he did not disdain to leave the cave with a begging bowl in hand and wander to the village for some food whenever the pangs of hunger stirred his body. An old widow took pity on him and thenceforth regularly supplied him with food, eventually insisting on bringing it up to his cave. Thus, his venture of faith in leaving his comfortable middle-class home was, in a measure, justified, at any rate to the extent that whatever powers there be have ensured his shelter and food. Many gifts have been since offered to him, but as a rule he turns them away. When a gang of dacoits broke into the hall one night not too long ago and searched the place for money, they were unable to find more than a few rupees, which was in the cave of the man who superintended the purchase of food. The robbers were so angry at this disappointment that they belabored the Maharishi with stout clubs, severely marking his body. The sage not only bore their attack patiently, but requested them to make a meal before they departed. Before they departed. He actually offered them some food. He had no hate towards them in his heart. Pity for their spiritual ignorance was the sole emotion they aroused. He let them escape freely, but within a year they were caught while committing another crime elsewhere and received stiff sentences of penal servitude. Not a few Western minds will inevitably consider that this life of the Maharishis is a wasted one, but perhaps it may be good for us to have a few men who sit apart from the world of unending activity and survey it for us from a distance. The onlooker may see more of the game, and sometimes he gets a truer perspective. It may also be that a jungle sage with self lying conquered at his feet is not inferior to a worldly fool who is blown hither and thither by every circumstance. A Search in Secret India by Paul Brunton. Day after day brings its fresh indications of the greatness of this man. Among the strangely diversified company of human beings who pass through the hermitage, a pariah stumbles into the hall in some great agony of soul or circumstance, and pours out his tribulation at the Maharishi's feet. The sage does not reply, for his silence and reserve are habitual. One can easily count up the number of words he uses in a single day. Instead, he gazes quietly at the suffering man, whose cries gradually diminish until he leaves the hall 2 hours later, a more serene and stronger man. I am learning to see that this is the Maharishi's way of helping others. This unobtrusive, silent, and steady outpouring of healing vibrations into troubled souls. This mysterious, telepathic process for which science will one day be required to account. A cultured Brahmin, college-bred, arrives with his questions. One can never be certain whether the sage will make a verbal response or not, for often he is eloquent enough without opening his lips. But today he is in a communicative mood, and a few of his terse phrases, packed with profound meaning as they usually are, open many vistas of thought for the visitor. A large group of visitors and devotees are in the hall when someone arrives with the news that a certain man, whose criminal reputation is a byword in the little township, is dead. Immediately there is some discussion about him, and, as is the wont of human nature, various people engage in recalling some of his crimes and the more dastardly phases of his character. When the hubbub has subsided and the discussion appears to have ended, the Maharishi opens his mouth for the first time and quietly observes, "Yes, but he kept himself very clean, for he bathed 2 or 3 times a day." A peasant and his family have traveled over 100 miles to pay silent homage to the sage. He is totally illiterate, knows little beyond his daily work, his religious rites and ancestral superstitions. He has heard from someone that there is a God in human form living at the foot of the hill of the Holy Beacon. He sits on the floor quietly after having prostrated himself 3 times. He firmly believes that some blessing of spirit or fortune will come to him as a result of this journey. His wife moves gracefully to his side and drops to the floor. She is clothed in a purple robe which flows smoothly from head to ankles and is then tucked into her waist. Her sleek, smooth hair is glossy and scented with oil. Her daughter accompanies her. She is a very pretty girl whose ankle rings click in concert as she steps into the hall, and she follows the charming custom of wearing a white flower behind her ear. The little family stay for a few hours, hardly speaking, and gaze in reverence at the Maharishi. It is clear that his mere presence provides them with spiritual assurance, emotional facility, and most paradoxical of all, renewed faith in their creed. For the sage treats all creeds alike, regards them all as significant and sincere expressions of a great experience, and honors Jesus no less than Krishna. On my left squats an old man of 75. A quid of betel is comfortably tucked in his cheek. A Sanskrit book lies between his hands, and his heavily lidded eyes stare meditatively at the bold print. He is a Brahmin who was the station master near Madras for many years. He retired from the railway service at 60, and soon after his wife died. He took the opportunity thus presented of realizing some long-deferred aspirations. For 14 years he traveled about the country on pilgrimage to the sages and saints and yogis, trying to find one whose teachings and personality were sufficiently appealing to him. He had circled India thrice, but no such master had been discernible. He had set up a very individual standard, apparently. When we met and compared notes, he lamented his failure His rugged, honest face, carved by wrinkles into dark furrows, appealed to me. He was not an intellectual man, but simple and quite intuitive. Being considerably younger than he, I felt it incumbent on me to give the old man some good advice. His surprising response was a request to become his master. "Your master is not far off," I told him, and conducted him straight away to the Maharishi. It did not take long for him to agree with me and become an enthusiastic devotee of the sage. Another man in the hall is a bespectacled, silken-clad, and prosperous-looking man. He is a judge who has taken advantage of a law vacation to pay a visit to the Maharishi. He is a keen disciple and strong admirer, and never fails to come at least once a year. This cultured, refined, and highly educated gentleman squats democratically among a group of Tamils who are poor, naked to the waist, and smeared with oil so that their bodies glisten like varnished ebony. That which brings them together destroys the insufferable snobbishness of caste and produces unity, and is that which causes princes and rajas to come from afar in ancient times to consult the forest rishis. The deep recognition that true wisdom is worth the sacrifice of superficial differences. A young woman with a gaily attired child enters and prostrates herself in veneration before the sage. Some profound problems of life are being discussed, so she sits in silence, not venturing to take part in intellectual conversation. Learning is not regarded as an ornament for Hindu women, and she knows little outside the purlieus of culinary and domestic matters, but she knows when she is in the presence of undeniable greatness. With the descent of dusk comes the time for a general group meditation in the hall. Not infrequently, the Maharishi will signal the time by entering so gently as occasionally to be unnoticed, the trance-like abstraction wherein he locks his senses against the world outside. During these daily meditations, in the potent neighborhood of the sage, I have learned how to carry my thoughts inward to an ever-deepening point. It is impossible to be in frequent contact with him without becoming lit up inwardly, as it were, mentally illuminated by a sparkling ray from his spiritual orb. Again and again, I become conscious that he is drawing my mind into his own atmosphere during these periods of quiet repose. And it is at such times that one begins to understand why the silences of this man are more significant than his utterances. His quiet, unhurried poise veils a dynamic attainment which can powerfully affect a person without the medium of audible speech or visible action. There are moments when I feel this power so greatly that I know he has only to issue the most disturbing command, and I will readily obey it. But the Maharishi is the last person in the world to place his followers in the chains of servile obedience, and allows everyone the utmost freedom of action. In this regard, he is quite refreshingly different from most of the teachers and yogis I have met in India. My meditations take the line he has indicated during my first visit, when he had tantalized me with a vagueness which seemed to surround many of his answers. I have begun to look into myself. Who am I? Am I this body of flesh, blood, and bone? Am I the mind, the thoughts, the feelings, which distinguish me from every other person. One has hitherto naturally and unquestioningly accepted the affirmative answer to these questions. But the Maharishi has warned me not to take them for granted. Yet he has refused to formulate any systematic teaching. The gist of his message is: pursue the inquiry, who am I, relentlessly. Analyze your entire personality. Try to find out where the I thought begins. Go on with your meditations. Keep turning your attention within. One day, the wheel of thought will slow down, and an intuition will mysteriously arise. Follow that intuition. Let your thinking stop, and it will eventually lead you to the goal. I struggle daily with my thoughts and cut my way slowly into the inner recesses of mind. In the helpful proximity of the Maharishi, my meditations and self-soliloquies become increasingly less tiring and more effective. A strong tendency and a sense of being guided inspire my constantly repeated efforts. There are strange hours when I am clearly conscious of the unseen power of the sage being powerfully impacted on my mentality, and with the result that I penetrate a little deeper still into the shrouded borderland of being which surrounds the human mind. The close of every evening sees the emptying of the hall as the sage, his disciples, and visitors adjourn for supper to the dining room. As I do not care for their food and will not trouble to prepare my own, I usually remain alone and await their return. However, there is one item of the hermitage diet which I find attractive and palatable, and that is curds. The Maharishi, having discovered my fondness for it, usually asks the cook to bring me a cupful of the drink each night. About half an hour after their return, the inmates of the hermitage, together with those visitors who have remained, wrap themselves up in sheets or thin cotton blankets and retire to sleep on the tiled floor of the hall. The sage himself uses his divan as a bed. Before he finally covers himself with the white sheets, his faithful attendant thoroughly massages his limbs with oil. I take up a glazed iron lantern when leaving the hall and set out on my lonely walk to the hut. Countless fireflies move among the flowers and the plants and the trees. Once, when I am 2 or 3 hours later than usual, and midnight is approaching, I observe these strange insects put out their weird lights. Often, they are just as numerous among the thick growth of bush and cactus through which I have to later pass. One has to be careful not to tread on scorpions or snakes in the dark. Sometimes the current of meditation has seized me so profoundly that I am unable and unwilling to stop it, so that I pay little heed to the narrow path of lighted ground upon which I walk. And so I retire to my modest hut, close the tightly fitting heavy door, and draw the shutters over my glassless windows to keep out unwelcome animal intruders. My last glimpse is of a thicket of palm trees which stands on one side of my clearing in the bush, the silver moonlight coming in streams over their interlaced feathery tops.